Speak it with certainty, the quiet discipline of autosuggestion. A 1 hour narration script on goal setting, self talk, and the psychology of persistence. The man in the quiet room. Picture a man alone in a small room at night. The door is shut. No one is listening but him. His eyes are closed, and he is talking, out loud, to no one, describing a version of his future as though it has already arrived. Not "I hope to." Not "I'm working toward." He says, "I can see it. I can almost touch it. It is already on its way." If you overheard him through the wall, you might think he'd lost his grip on reality. But this exact habit, speaking a goal aloud in the present tense, as though it were already unfolding, is one of the oldest self-discipline practices in the personal development tradition, going back at least a century to writers like Napoleon Hill, who studied dozens of self-made industrialists of his era and tried to distill what, if anything, they had in common. I want to spend the next hour walking through that practice honestly. What it actually is, what real psychology has to say about pieces of it, where it overreaches into wishful thinking, and how to use the useful parts without fooling yourself. Let's start with the man in the room, because everything else builds from him. What autosuggestion actually is. The practice has an old-fashioned name: autosuggestion, self-suggestion. The deliberate act of feeding your own mind a specific, repeated idea on purpose instead of letting your thoughts drift wherever the day happens to push them. It's worth being precise about what it is not, because a century of self-help marketing has blurred the line badly. It is not a request sent out into the universe. It is not a belief that saying words changes the external world by itself. Money does not fall out of the sky because you described it convincingly at bedtime. Nothing about this practice suspends cause and effect. What it is, and this part has real grounding in psychology, is a method for shaping your own attention, expectations, and follow-through. Modern research on self-talk, implementation intentions, and mental rehearsal supports a narrower but genuinely useful claim. The way you talk to yourself and the way you rehearse a goal in your mind measurably affects your motivation, your persistence when things get hard, and how quickly you notice opportunities related to that goal. Athletes use mental rehearsal before competition. Surgeons use it before difficult procedures. It isn't magic, it's attention training. So hold both truths at once as we go. The exercise is genuinely useful for the mind that performs it, and it is not a mechanism that pulls money or outcomes out of thin air. Everything I say for the rest of this hour sits inside that boundary. The gate you already control. Here's the core mental model, and it's a good one, even stripped of any mystical framing. Your conscious mind acts like a gate. All day, impressions arrive, things you see, hear, read, worry about, scroll past. And your conscious mind has some say over which of those impressions you dwell on, rehearse, and let shape your mood and your next action. You don't control what crosses your path. You have real, if imperfect, control over what you keep turning over once it's there. Think of your deeper habits of mind, your default assumptions about what you're capable of, what's realistic, what's worth attempting, as a garden. Left alone, a garden doesn't stay empty. Something grows in it, regardless of whether you tend it. If you never plant anything on purpose, the space fills with whatever seeds happen to blow in. Today's bad news, a stray criticism from years ago, the ambient anxiety of a hard week. This is really just a description of a well-documented psychological pattern. Unmanaged rumination tends to skew negative because worry and threat detection are cognitively sticky. If you don't deliberately practice a different pattern of thought, the mind doesn't default to neutral. It tends to default to vigilance and doubt. That's not a character flaw. It's how attention naturally works. But it does mean that doing nothing is not actually a neutral choice. Something is being rehearsed either way. So the practical takeaway isn't control your subconscious with willpower. It's smaller and more honest. Decide on purpose what you're going to rehearse. Because if you don't decide, something will get rehearsed anyway. And it usually isn't the most useful thing. Speaking the goal in the present tense. Now, the actual exercise and the specifics matter more than people expect. Find a quiet moment. Many people find the minutes before sleep and the minutes after waking work best, simply because the mind is less cluttered with the day's noise at those times. Say your goal out loud, not silently. There's a real, if modest, effect documented in memory and motivation research called the production effect. Speaking something aloud engages more of your attention and encodes it more strongly than reading it silently. Here is the structure that separates a vague wish from a workable statement. A specific outcome, not more money or more success, an exact, concrete target. Vague goals produce vague effort. This is one of the best supported findings in goal-setting psychology. It's the backbone of the classic Locke and Latham research on goal specificity. Specific, challenging goals reliably outperform do-your-best goals. A specific date, a deadline converts an aspiration into a plan you can check yourself against. Without one, a goal has no way to tell you whether you're behind, on track, or done. What you will give in return. This is the part people skip, and it's the most important one. No outcome worth having arrives without some service, skill, or effort exchanged for it. Naming that exchange up front keeps the exercise honest. It's a goal, not a wish. Say it in the language of near arrival, not distant hope. Not, I hope someday I'll have this. Instead, I am working toward this specific outcome, by this date, in exchange for this effort, and I can already picture what it looks like when it's done. That last part, picturing it, is where mental rehearsal earns its keep. Visualization doesn't manufacture the outcome. What it does, according to a fair amount of sports psychology and cognitive behavioral research, is help you rehearse the steps toward the outcome, which improves follow-through. And it keeps the goal emotionally salient enough that you don't quietly abandon it after a rough week. Write the statement down. Read it out loud twice a day. Once when you start your day, once before you end it. Not because repetition is mystical, but because consistency is the entire game in behavior change. A goal you revisit for 30 seconds twice a day survives. A goal you write once and never look at again quietly dies. Why flat words don't work. Here's the honest warning, and it's the part most versions of this teaching get right, even when they oversell everything else. Reciting a goal in a flat, distracted voice does almost nothing. If you say your statement mechanically while thinking about your grocery list, you haven't practiced anything. This matches what we actually know about memory and motivation. Engagement, not repetition alone, is what makes a thought stick and what makes it influence behavior. The reason most people who try affirmations or goal statements quit and conclude it doesn't work is usually this. They treated the words as the practice, when the words were only ever the container. The actual ingredient is attention plus genuine feeling. Caring about the outcome enough that saying it out loud actually produces some emotional charge, even a small one. So the honest instruction isn't repeat the words. It's don't bother saying them unless you're going to actually attend to what you're saying. A single genuinely felt repetition beats 20 distracted ones. Where does the belief come from if you don't have it yet? This is the fair objection, and it deserves a straight answer rather than a dodge. If you don't yet believe you'll hit the goal, how can you say it with any conviction without lying to yourself? Here's the honest version of the answer. You don't need full belief on day one. Confidence is not a precondition for starting. It's frequently a result of small, repeated evidence that you're capable of the thing. This is well supported in psychology under the idea of self-efficacy. Confidence tends to build from actually doing small pieces of the work and noticing you can, not from psyching yourself up in advance. So the honest sequence looks like this. State the goal, take one small real action toward it, notice that you did it, and let that tiny bit of evidence do more work than the words alone ever could. Repeat. The belief that eventually feels solid isn't manufactured by repetition of the sentence. It's built by a track record of small proofs that accumulate underneath the sentence. This matters because it also explains why pure repetition without action eventually rings hollow, which brings us to the most important part of this whole hour. The part nobody wants to hear. Action is not optional. There is a genuine failure mode in this practice, and it's worth naming plainly because it wrecks the whole exercise if you fall into it. Some people learn to state a goal with conviction, visualize it vividly, feel good doing it, and then do nothing differently the next day. They mistake the feeling of having addressed the goal for actually having worked on it. This is a documented psychological trap. Vividly imagining a desired outcome can, for some people, reduce the felt urgency to pursue it, because the mind partially checks the box on the emotional level. Researchers who study goal visualization, Gabriele Eddingen's work is the clearest example, found that fantasizing about success on its own, without also confronting the real obstacles in the way, can actually lower effort and follow through compared to not visualizing at all. So here's the corrective, and it's the single most load-bearing idea in this whole hour. The statement only works if it's paired with real, unglamorous action. Practically, that means your nightly statement should include not just the outcome, but the obstacle standing between you and it, and the very next concrete step you'll take, regardless of how you feel in the morning. Say the goal. Name what's in the way. Name the next action. Then, the next day, actually take it, especially on the days you don't feel like it, because those are exactly the days the habit either survives or dies. Each time you follow through on a small step, two things happen. You get closer to the goal, and, just as important, you give your own mind real evidence that this isn't an empty ritual. That evidence is what eventually turns a stiff, unconvincing statement into one you say with real conviction. Because by then, it's simply describing your actual trajectory. Skip the action, and the statement becomes exactly what its critics accuse it of being: comforting noise that changes nothing. Putting it together. So let's close the loop and go back to the man in the quiet room. He is not doing anything mystical. He is doing three ordinary things on purpose that most people do by accident or not at all. He is choosing, deliberately, what to rehearse in his own mind instead of leaving that space to whatever the day happened to dump into it. He is making his goals specific enough to actually act on, a real number, a real date, a real exchange of effort, instead of a vague wish that can never be checked against reality. And critically, he is treating the statement as a daily commitment to act, not a substitute for acting. The words are the first 5 minutes of the discipline. The other 23 hours and 55 minutes are where the goal actually gets built. If you want to try this yourself, here's the practical version, stripped of any mysticism. Write one specific goal, a number or outcome, a date, and what you'll give in exchange for it. Say it out loud, with real attention, once in the morning and once before bed. Each time you say it, name the very next concrete action, something small enough you can actually do it tomorrow. Do that action, especially on the days it feels pointless. Let your own follow-through, not the repetition itself, be what slowly turns the statement from something you're saying into something you actually believe, because it's simply becoming true. That's the whole practice. Not a shortcut around effort, a way of making sure effort has a clear direction and doesn't quietly get lost in a hard week. Speak it plainly, mean it as much as you can on a given day, and then go do the next small thing, regardless of whether the feeling was perfect. That's the discipline underneath all the packaging, and it's the only part of it that actually moves anything in the real world. What happens when the streak breaks? I want to talk about something almost no version of this teaching addresses honestly. What happens on the night you forget, or the morning you skip it, or the week where life gets loud enough that the whole practice falls off your radar entirely? Because it will happen. Not might, will. And what you do in that moment matters more than anything I've said so far, because it's the moment that decides whether this becomes a lifelong habit or a thing you tried for 11 days in March. Here is the trap. A broken streak feels like proof of failure. You skipped 3 days, so some part of you concludes the whole effort was fake, that you were never really committed, that the version of you who started this was kidding himself. That conclusion feels honest in the moment. It is almost never accurate, and it is worth understanding why. Because the same faulty logic sabotages diets, exercise routines, savings plans, and every other habit that depends on daily repetition. Behavioral research on habit formation is fairly consistent on this point. A single missed day has almost no measurable effect on whether a habit eventually sticks. What predicts failure isn't the miss, it's the story you tell yourself about the miss. People who treat a skipped day as data, I was traveling, I'll pick it back up tonight, return to the habit at a far higher rate than people who treat a skipped day as a verdict. I guess I'm just not the kind of person who does this. The second group doesn't fail because they missed a day. They fail because missing a day gave them permission to stop. So build the exception into the plan from the start. Decide now, before it happens, that missing a day changes nothing except that you missed a day. The goal doesn't reset. The date doesn't move. You simply pick the statement back up the next time you can say it with attention, and you let the gap be exactly as meaningful as it actually is, which is not very. The voice of other people. There's a second obstacle that has nothing to do with your own discipline and everything to do with the people around you, and it deserves a straight answer too. At some point, you will mention this goal to someone, a specific number, a specific date, and you will watch their face do something complicated. Maybe they're kind about it. Maybe they're not. Either way, you'll feel the pull to soften the goal in front of them, to round it down, to add a joking qualifier so it sounds less exposed. Here's the useful distinction. Skepticism from other people is not the same thing as evidence. A friend's doubt tells you something about your friend's own experience, their own ceiling for what feels plausible, their own history of goals that didn't land. It tells you almost nothing about your specific situation, your specific plan, or your specific effort. People generalize from themselves by default. It's not malice, it's just how untested opinions form. That said, there's a version of this that isn't just noise, and it's worth being honest about too. If someone who has actually done the specific thing you're attempting tells you your plan has a real, concrete flaw, a timeline that doesn't match how long the work actually takes, a step you're missing, a cost you haven't accounted for, that's not discouragement, that's information, and a good plan absorbs it rather than defending against it. The skill isn't ignore all doubt. The skill is telling apart a stranger's reflexive pessimism from a specialist's specific correction, and only letting the second kind change your plan. Practically, keep the daily statement private, or share it only with people who've actually shown up for you before. Save the specific number and date for people who've earned the right to have an opinion about them. Everyone else gets the general shape of what you're working on, if anything at all. This isn't secrecy for its own sake. It's just protecting a fragile new habit from noise it doesn't need yet. The same way you wouldn't run a new business plan past a stranger at a bus stop and let their shrug decide anything. Reviewing, not just repeating. One more piece, and then I'll let this rest. If all you do is repeat the same sentence for months without ever checking it against reality, you've built a ritual, not a plan. The statement needs a periodic honest look. Not daily, that's too often to see real movement, but perhaps every couple of weeks, where you ask 3 plain questions. Is the date still realistic, given what I actually know now that I didn't know when I wrote it? Sometimes the honest answer is yes. Sometimes it's no. And adjusting the date isn't quitting. It's the plan getting more accurate as you learn more, which is what a good plan is supposed to do. Have I actually taken the small actions I named, or have I been saying the goal without doing the work underneath it? This is the question people avoid, because the honest answer is sometimes uncomfortable. Ask it anyway. The whole practice we've walked through only functions if this answer stays honest. And has anything I've learned changed what the next concrete step should be? A plan written on day 1 is working with day 1 information. By week 6, you know more than you did. Use it. Update the step. The statement isn't a vow carved in stone. It's a working draft you're allowed to sharpen. That review is what keeps the practice from calcifying into empty repetition, the exact failure mode we spent part 4 warning about. Words said with attention, paired with real action, checked periodically against reality. That's the whole mechanism, start to finish. Nothing about it requires belief in anything mystical. It just requires you to actually do it, on the ordinary days, especially the ones where doing it feels like the least interesting thing available to you. That's where this one ends. Write the sentence, say it like you mean it. Do the next small thing tomorrow. Check your work in 2 weeks. Repeat.